what should we do about sweatshops? There seem to be two kinds of positions. One position is just that we should stop sweatshops. The other position is that we should just let them go ahead and that they're actually a good thing. Average, everyday citizens, we could all just make a choice to buy fair trade products. Don't buy things that we know are coming from exploitive countries. We know more, for example, about Apple and Foxconn and how the products that are made by Apple are basically coming out of a sweatshop. So one thing we could do is stop buying Apple products. We could boycott that. There are worries about feasibility, whether this is a feasible way of avoiding exploitation. Because for it to really work, there would have to be universal boycotting of Apple. Everyone would have to boycott it for it to be effective, for it to motivate Apple to stop using Foxconn as a supplier. That seems very unlikely. Also, if we encourage people to stop shopping from potentially exploitive companies, there's a worry that we would be forcing the poor to sort of take on a certain kind of burden. Typically, products that come from sweatshops are cheaper than they would be if they were made at places that were not exploitive, places that paid a non-exploitive wage. So if you're already struggling, it would be very difficult to buy fair trade goods. As you know, fair trade coffee and other goods are quite expensive. And that might be a burden we don't think is fair. Poor people are suffering, and even in developed countries, and are just trying to make ends meet, and it seems like an undue burden to ask them to take on. One kind of institutional proposal is to maybe not pay as much as $10, but go for a different kind of minimum wage, maybe $3 or $4 per day of work. That's less than $10 an hour or whatever. And it would seem better than the current situation. I think ideally this probably is a better solution, but I'm still skeptical about the possibilities of this as being a workable solution. And my skepticism comes largely from a skepticism about international institutions writ large. If we look at sort of the history of international institutions, if we look at the IMF and the World Bank, and we think about how these organizations have been funded and run, we see there are lots of problems. So typically any major sort of international institution has to be funded by countries who have the money to fund them. So that means the G7 and predominantly the United States. And since these are the countries that are sort of funding these organizations, it tends to happen that the way these organizations run is such that they promote the interests of those that are funding it, particularly the G7 and specifically the United States. So one worry is that if we had a law that required that people make a certain amount a day, let's say $3 or $4 a day, which is less than what we make in developed countries, but more than people make in the current sweatshops. There's a worry about enforcement. Someone would have to lay charges against a firm that it was exploiting, that it was paying less than the fair or minimum wage. And you have to wonder about when people would actually lay these charges. And when we look at other international institutions like the World Trade Organization, we see that these kinds of charges tend to be laid when it promotes American interests. So imagine that a firm is in Indonesia and it's a non-American firm that's competing with an American firm for a product like shoes. And if it might be in the interest to pursue an exploitation charge in that case. So in the end, although none of us like sweatshops, we think they're exploitive, and rightfully so, they are exploitive and they're taking advantage of people's dire circumstances. It seems like the only feasible solution for now is to allow exploitation to occur, to allow sweatshops to continue. And that's an unfortunate circumstance.